Hi, my name is William Lozada.
Hi, my name's Samantha Hill.
You're watching GPS 19. Check it out.
I'm Pat Schaefer. I'm president of the New London County Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you to our talk today. This afternoon, we're going to hear about the history of Groton Bank. Tom Malthuis was one of the co-founders and is currently the president of the Groton Bank Historical Association. He's retired from Pfizer and clearly knows a great deal about Groton Bank and is always happy to share his information with other people. Be sure you keep your maps handy so that you can be looking at the streets as he's mentioning the different places in Groton Bank. So shall we move the projector?
I have already put it. I think it's okay. Otherwise we'll move it some more. Well, I want to thank you, Pat, for the opportunity to come here and talk about Groton Bank, which, of course, has become one of my favorite topics as well as one of my favorite places. First of all, Groton Bank wasn't always known by that name. Groton Bank was simply simply referred to as the East Side back in the 1600s when it was still part of New London. As you may recall, you all know New London was basically settled in 1646, and at that time, or shortly thereafter, the Pequot colony included all lands 4 miles east and west of the Thames River. So Groton Bank, which is that section of Groton between the Gold Star Bridge, which runs across here, and Electric Boat, which is down in here, was simply in the 1600s referred to as the East Bank or the East Side. It didn't become known as Groton Bank until actually about 1705 when Groton became a separate town. And this Beers, Ellis, and Soule map, which you all have copies of a more complete version, defines what Groton Bank entailed in the year 1868. Groton Bank is a relatively small area. It represents less than 0.4 of a square mile, which means it represents less than 1% of the geographic area of the town of Groton, yet it is extremely rich in history. And the name Groton Bank began to fade out of common usage in the late 1800s and early 1900s when this part of Groton Bank, which contained from where the leaders of the town lived in those days, decided it was time to form what was called the borough of Groton, which we now know as the city of Groton. There were many points of history in Groton Bank, and I want to point out that Groton Bank was first settled in 1655 when Cary Latham built his Ferry Tavern on a site right in this area, which is opposite what is now known as the Avery Cop House. In the years which followed, the 1655, of course, the main activity here, as far as we know, was agriculture and timber, but very shortly thereafter, shipbuilding began to take on a life of its own, even in the 1680s. Shipbuilding was carried out in New London in early days, but for whatever reasons, it did not really flourish here, and transferred to the east side of the river. Some say because of the deeper waters on that side, the better shoreline for launching ships and so forth, and perhaps more timber. Anyway, in the 1680s, Captain John Leeds came from England and started building ships for the coastal and transatlantic trade. Two examples are the Trial and the Swallow, which were built just south of what was the ferry lot that is right in this area of Groton Bank. Groton Bank became very notable in shipbuilding, setting its first major record that we know of back in 1725, when a man by the name of John Jeffreys and a Captain James Sterling, who had by that time taken over Leeds shipyard, built and launched a 720-ton wooden ship. At that time, the largest ship to have been launched in the colonies, and a record that was not broken for another nearly 50 years. Now, we could go on all day about just the shipbuilding history at Groton Bank, but let me just say, in terms of the wooden ship days, there were many other shipyards along here. The Starr family had a shipyard here. The Lathams had a shipyard just north of where EB is today, and the Lathams built some 60 large vessels there after the Revolutionary War and just before the War of 1812. And there were other shipyards like Samuel Moxley's, which is at the point just north of where the River Cafe is today, and many others. But shipbuilding shipbuilding continued to flourish in the 1800s, but by 1900 there was major changes. And in 1903, this area, which is now on the northern part of EB, was owned by a shipbuilding company called Eastern Shipbuilding, which was owned by James Hill, who was a railroad magnate and thought he was going to make big money shipping grain from the Midwest by railroad to the Pacific and then from there to Japan, and built two huge vessels, one called the Minnesota, because that was the state he was from, and the other Dakota. These were the largest steel freighters in the world, launched right here in the Thames River in 1903 and 1904. Of course, shipbuilding then took another turn to the underwater type, and electric boat came here in the early 1900s under a different name, but by World War II was very much involved in submarine construction, of course, and delivered 74 fleet-type submarines during the war. And I think everybody knows about the nuclear subs, beginning with the Nautilus in 1954. So there should be little question that this shipbuilding has been an important and a continuous history from colonial times to the present on the east bank of the Thames River, and even a history which the Brack Commission has finally realized. Another chapter in Groton Bank history, if you will, is a chapter of defense. Groton Bank, or Fort Griswold, has been an integral part of Groton Bank since its construction was started in 1775. This is a photo of about 1890, taken from the top of the monument. It gives you some sense as to what the view used to be from Fort Griswold looking down the Thames Harbor. It was no accident that this fort was built here. we had a fairly famous patriot who lived in Groton at the corner of what is now Thames and Broad Streets, and his name was Thomas Mumford. He did such things as actively protest things like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. He was a member of the Connecticut Assembly, and he supported the idea of the Connecticut militia going to Boston to assist Paul Revere. And he was one of 11 men who plotted the successful capture and takeover of Fort Ticonderoga. And so he was clearly aware of what was going on. And furthermore, he was a very wealthy merchant in New London, but chose to live on the Groton side of the river. And I want to point out at this time, the history of Groton Bank has many, many connections with New London. Many people who were active here lived in the suburb across the river, if you will, back in those times. So Thomas Mumford had his business in New London, but one of his businesses or sidelights was he was also the owner of 7 or 8 privateer ships, and which sailed into this harbor. And if for those of you who are not familiar, privateers were ships that were given the right to legally steal cargo and ships as long as they were doing it from the British. And so, what?
Legal pirates.
They were legal pirates, a good terminology. So, and as you all know from your New London harbor history, that this was really a very successful group of privateers in this area, and the British certainly wanted to get even even the score. So it was no surprise for his own self-interest that Thomas Mumford would propose that forts be built to protect the Thames Harbor. And Fort Griswold in Groton was the more substantial one at that time, it being an earthenwork of the so-called Star Fort design. And Fort Trumbull, which was over here in New London, back in colonial times, was nothing like the fortification you see today. It was simply a wooden stockade with to protect from invasion from the water, but had no protective properties in terms of land. So on September 6, 1781, Benedict Arnold was spotted off, or the British fleet under the command of Benedict Arnold was spotted off the coast, and Arnold landed 800 men on each side of the mouth of the Thames. You all know the history. They marched north, quickly overran Fort Trumbull. Those patriots came across the river and joined the ones in Fort Griswold, and much of New London, if not most of it, or almost all of it, except this and a few other structures, were burned. In Groton, of course, those 800 men were also marching for. There were in total approximately 160 colonists in the fort that morning, and they put up a valiant effort. It took the British three attacks before they finally scaled the southern wall of the fort and overtook it. There was great loss of life on both sides. Approximately half of the colonists, that is 80 some of them in the fort, were killed. A lot more were wounded. Colonel Ledyard, who commanded both forts, was killed in that battle. The British put many of the wounded in a wagon, and which the story goes they lost control of, and it rolled down the hill, hitting a tree stump near what's called the Ensign Ebenezer Avery House, which at that time was at the corner of what we know as Thames and Latham Streets today. Many of the wounded were left here, including Ensign Ebenezer Avery himself. This house has since been moved to Fort Griswold, where it is now restored. And From this point, the British did burn a few structures on Groton Bank, but most of them remained. One that they did single out was the house of Thomas Mumford, who is described as having owned a mansion in Groton on the river. But many other houses and structures did survive. The next part of the history of defense, it was the War of 1812, in which the fort was again manned. As you recall, the British had blockaded the harbor. Admiral Decatur was blockaded in here, and he, for quite some months, I believe, there never was a battle, but there was considerable concern that there would be. So the only real battle that has ever taken place at either of these forts was the Revolutionary War Battle of September 6, 1781. Fort Griswold continued to be manned, of course, as did Fort Trumbull. And in the 1840s, a new munitions building and a shot furnace to heat cannonball red hot to fire into those wooden ships was built in the lower part of the fort. By the Spanish-American War, the lower battery looked about like this, and another view looking up the hill around 1900. Today, of course, we are not known for defense in the local sense, but it's interesting that the leadership role that the Groton Bank area and the harbor area played in shipbuilding throughout 3 centuries, when combined with the role in harbor defense, have now merged to the broader issue of leadership in national defense with submarines and a leadership role that, as I said earlier, the BRAC Commission is now realizing. Another chapter in Groton Bank history is one of business and commerce. And again, much of this history is intermingled with New London, and New London in this area undoubtedly played the leadership role, but Groton Bank was an important player as well. I've already talked about shipbuilding. The West Indies trade was big in this area from the late 1600s to the War of 1812. Examples of people that were very much involved in this trade were the Ledyard family. That is the relatives of Colonel William Ledyard and his brother Ebenezer, who also played a role in the war, the Revolutionary War. There was considerable coastal trade and shipping from the harbor between Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, Virginia, etc. And of course, whaling and sealing was a big endeavor from the 1820s to 1908. The port of New London was generally, through this era, the second most important whaling port in the country. New Bedford was first, and occasionally Nantucket would slip to second, and New London would be third. But generally, the port of New London was number 2 through this era, and many sea captains who sailed out of the port of New London lived at Groton Bank. One example of one of those fellows is Captain Ebenezer Rattler Morgan. He lived on Groton Bank from at least 1850 to 1890, and he achieved quite some fame when he went out to sea in 1863 and returned a year later, or about a couple months more than a year, with a cargo in which he profited about $100,000. Now, in 1864-5, that was real money, $100,000. Not that we throw it away today, but it doesn't last all that long. Captain Morgan did a number of other voyages, but having had this great financial success, also went into businesses. He was a member, or he was a major stockholder in what was called the Alaska Commercial Company, which was here in New London, and did a number of voyages to Alaska. In fact, he was the first man to plant the American flag on Alaskan territory after we purchased it from the Russians. And we'll come back to him in another sense. Another very famous sea captain in this era was also a Captain William H. Allen. Captain Morgan, before his voyage, lived up here on Broad Street, which was Old King's Road back in 100 or more years ago, and later moved to Monument Street after his successful voyage. Captain William H. Allen soon broke Captain Morgan's record, going out to sea a couple of years later, but he stayed out to sea for several years, but coming back with a cargo worth $417,000. Again, big, big money in those days. Captain Allen was a civic leader and also involved in many businesses, was one of the organizers after his successful voyage of the Mariners Savings Bank in New London, and also its president in the late 1800s. We had a number of bankers of Groton Bank, but most of these folks, to my knowledge, all worked in New London banks. Despite our name, Groton Bank, and when we started reviving the Historical Association, some people would say, well, I don't know anything about this bank. I'm not going to put any money in it. But the bankers of Groton Bank were primarily bankers in New London. In fact, I don't know if there ever was a bank on Groton Bank. So that was also part of the Groton Bank business and commerce story. And of course, there were many spin-off businesses from whaling and the prosperity that it brought to both sides of the river. Another chapter in Groton's bank's history is that of transportation. And of course, in discussing these chapters, we kind of have to sort them out and start back from year one again. Transportation really began in 1651 when a fellow by the name of Edward Messenger was the first ferryman. And his ferry was simply a dugout canoe. He was probably the first settler of Groton, but he didn't live in Groton Bank per se. And the first person to live in Groton Bank and be the settler was Carey Latham. He was one of the original party that came to New London with John Winthrop, and in 1655 was awarded the ferry contract with two new stipulations that Edward Messenger didn't have. One was he had to live on the east bank of the river, and secondly, he had to have a ferry service that would be able to transport man and beast. So the Carey Latham's ferry service was one horse canoe and three smaller canoes. Now, I don't know how agile you are in a canoe, but I'm pretty tippy, and I'd hate to think about going across the Thames River with a horse too. And then the second ferryman was John Leeds. This is the same John Leeds who started shipbuilding in Groton Bank. because as our town historian tells it, John Leeds made his money the old-fashioned way. He married the daughter of Carrie Latham, and Carrie Latham owned most of the property and buildings in Groton Bank in this period of time. So he took over the ferry service in 1681 and 2. So that was your local transportation, if you will, from across the river. If you were going further, of course, remember, land transportation was almost non-existent back in those days. You heard the trials and tribulations of the annual meeting of taking a horse from Boston to New York, but it was a long ordeal, and the best way to travel was by ship along the coast, and people traveled by going on commercial ships that were trading, say, to the West Indies, as well as there were numerous packet ships that went up and down the coast, and some of those captains, like J.W. Minor, was a packet ship captain who lived on Groton Bank. In 1821, there was really a revolution in terms of enhancing the transportation across the Thames River. A larger ferry was put into service, and this ferry was propelled by 4 blind horses running on a treadmill. Seems weird today, but that's, I guess, was better than rowing. But what did this enable to do? Remember, the Thames River, as wide as it is, was a major obstacle to transportation between New York and Boston. Up to this point in time, stagecoaches going from New York to Boston had to go on inland to Norwich and around the river and then come back down. This ferry enabled now not only stagecoaches to be taken across, but wagons of all sorts. You could take loads of hay on wagons and wood and so forth. So instead of just people and a few animals, now some real cargo could be taken across the river. And with the stagecoach being able to get on this ferry, the stagecoach could leave New York at 6 a.m. in the morning and get to Boston by 2 o'clock the next afternoon. Sometimes Amtrak doesn't do that well, but most of the time it's better. Another revolution in the transportation was the first steam ferry. There were steam ships, maybe as much as 20 years prior to 1849. I don't know why it took so long to get a steam ferry to go across the river. But anyway, in 1849, the first steam ferry was put into service. It was called the Mohegan. It presumably landed now at a different location. We don't know exactly where, but remember I said the Carrie Latham ferry operated out here from a site opposite the Avery Cop House. And of course, those were very different days. There was a town bulletin board there, and there were stockades to put the people who misbehaved in so that you could all ridicule them as you got on the ferry and help row yourself across the river. Now, by 1868, the ferry service was coming into the end of Pleasant Street, and whether that was certainly a steam ferry then, but whether it was the same one as 1849, we just don't have the records to verify that. But it stands to reason that the ferry slip would change due to the nature of the ferry and who owned the property and so forth. And yet, if you look, you have a more complete version of this map. If you look to the south, you'll see there's a shoreline railroad ferry that comes into what is today the northern end of the EB property. And that ferry was put into service, again a steam ferry between Groton Bank and New London in 1859. Again, Railroads in the 1850s had come as far as New York to New London, but there was just a big gap between the Thames River and Rhode Island, because again, getting across that river was such a barrier. Some trains did go up toward Norwich, but I don't think there were tracks going further east from Norwich at that time. So this was not, of course, a ferry that you put the whole train on. This ferry only took the railroad cars with its passengers. So there were roundhouses at both New London and Groton Bank, and the engines were dismantled, similar to what we used to, I presume similar to what we used to experience in New Haven before the days of total electric, when you took the diesel to New Haven and switched engines to that. But there was another facet to this. These cars were not only dismantled from the engine, they now had to be pushed onto a railroad ferry. And that ferry then was propelled by steam across the river. The river was often rough. It was, and choppy. You got it. You must have been there. You've been on, and so forth. And in the 1860s, Charles Dickens was one of those passengers and wrote a very unflattering account about what it was like to cross the Thames River by railroad ferry. Transportation continued to improve, fortunately, and we saw a big leap forward in the year 1889. This was with the construction now of the first railroad bridge across the Thames River. This is from a book called Historic New London, published in 1901, which says it was one of the largest bridges of like character in the world. Here, this shows another view of it from the water. And Groton soon had a railroad station, not like New London, but it had one, or Groton Bank. However, for the locals, the ferry between Groton Bank and New London was still the way to get across the river. This was the Governor Winthrop Ferry, which ran for many years. Whoops, we lost something here. That ferry now, in 1900, came in at the end of School Street, which is still named School Street on the 1868 map. And this is the ferry slip. This is the building in which Ken's Tackle Shop is in today, if you're familiar with that. And just step back a little bit further. This is that new building in 1898, and this was the hub. It's still there today. This was the hub of activity in Groton 100 years ago. This is the Carlos Allen grocery store and the ferry slip. There was a waiting room here. You could come up the ramp and get on a trolley, which went down Thames Street and along Pequannock Road to Pequannock and Noank and Mystic and on from there. And I might, these buildings that you see here are all still there today. This is the Carlos Allen store at the turn of the century. It was primarily groceries and other provisions. You could buy a biscuit for a nickel. And there were other things you could do. There was a pool hall to pass your time, presumably while waiting for the ferry or waiting for Aunt Millie to pick you up. And there were other offices further down in the building, such as the headquarters of Robert Dennison, who was a paper hanger, da-da-da-da. And of course, while you were there, it was a strategic location. You might as well get your groceries and other provisions. Notice this is still the kerosene era, but life didn't change much when electricity came in. It looks pretty much the same. On just north of that, on the same side of the street, is a building, was the apothecary or drug and medicines, as well as telegraph office. This building or that are no longer there. They're on the parking lot of what's now the Botel or Motel at the end of School Street. And a little further north, these buildings are still there. The offices and the shop of the Marquardt brothers were diverting a little bit by transportation and doing some foot transportation as we work our way back to the railroad bridge. These buildings are still here and are shops today. Another example of a Thames Street residence. Thames Street was a pretty picturesque street back then. With still, yeah, and this house is still there. This is, if you look closely, this is a modified center chimney colonial. Center chimney colonials were characteristic of houses of the 1750s, and so it obviously survived the British. It's been modified and modified again. That's one of the things about Groton Bank. The people that lived in this area were generally quite prosperous for their times and also wanted to keep up with the times in modern ways. And so they often put additions and changes to their houses to make them more stylish for the time. This is prime example of that is the Avery Cop House. This is a photo again of the turn of the century, about 100 years ago. The Avery Cop House was originally a center hall colonial. The Cops were a very wealthy family and wanted to modernize it, and they added a gable off the front and bay windows and so forth, basically turning it into an Italianate style Victorian in the late 1800s. A similar house to it has had fewer changes. This is the house next north. If we're walking along Thames Street, the Captain Rufus Avery house. I point this out because Captain Avery was on duty at Fort Griswold back that morning of September 6, 1781, and was the first man to spot the British fleet off our coast. He survived the battle and had this house built for himself about 6 years after the battle. It is a center hallway colonial as well, very close in design to the Cop House and what the Cop House looked like, but has fewer modifications today. Another home of a defender of Fort Griswold is across the street from that, the Park Avery house. Again, he fought in the battle, survived, had this house built within a year of the battle. It was a smaller version. It was a one-story cape without all the Victorian embellishments that were added in the 1800s. Park Avery was also one of the people instrumental in the construction of the fort. Gambrel roof colonial, just another form of architecture. And this colonial home, another center hallway design, is probably the most famous house in Groton and Groton Bank, being the Mother Bailey house. It sits at the corner of Broad and Thames Street today. The Mother Bailey, for those of you who don't know the story, was a heroine first of the Battle of September 6th in 1781, when she was the first woman to enter the fort looking for her uncle, and Dr. Prentice, the local physician, was already there tending the wounded, and she stayed on and helped him in that sad endeavor. Dr. Prentice originally built this house a year after the battle, that is in 1782, and this was on property owned by that patriot Thomas Mumford, who I mentioned earlier. Thomas Mumford's mansion was supposedly across the street from this. It was burned by the British, and I think he moved on to Norwich after that and sold what he had in Groton Bank. But anyway, Dr. Prentice lived here for a while. By the 1800s, Mother Bailey and her husband had purchased it, and she received even more fame in the War of 1812. One day she was passing down Thames Street, and soldiers were looking for cannon wadding, which was important to have, to stuff in cannon, those to get them to fire better and so forth. And flannel is what they needed. And so she was asked if she had any flannel as she was walking down Thames Street, and said, "Why, sure." And she immediately took off her petticoats and gave them to the soldiers. Well, that was pretty risque. And this received national attention. Such national attention that she was visited in this house in subsequent years by 3 U.S. presidents, Jackson, Monroe, and Van Buren, as well as a couple of times by General Lafayette. And President Jackson is reported to have given her the wrought iron fence around the house, part of which remains today. So she got lots of mileage out of those petticoats. She had another fairly famous neighbor as well, and that was Major Noyes Barber. Major Barber was a major in the Connecticut militia protecting the shoreline in the War of 1812. He happened to be a good friend of Admiral Decatur as well, and when the admiral and his officers were blockaded here in the harbor, they reportedly had many parties in this house, which still stands at the corner of Thames and Broad Streets today. Major Barber was a really industrious guy. He was in business already when he was 11 years old. And in 1821, he ran for Congress and was elected, and again for 7 consecutive terms. The most controversial thing that he did was he was a Jeffersonian Republican, which I guess was a pro-war party and more conservative party. And in the 1820s, I think it was 1823, the Electoral College was tied on and didn't have a majority voting for president, so it was thrown in the House of Representatives. And Major Barber, or Congressman Barber, created quite a stir because rather than voting for his party's candidate, he decided he would vote for his friend John Quincy Adams, which he did. And John Quincy Adams, as you know, became president. Just a little touch of local national history as it stretches down locally. Major Barber had another connection, and that was he was the son of one of the ministers of the First Congregational Church in Groton, and that church years later, the land was given, or back in 1833, and that church was built just north of Major Barber's, or Congressman Barber's house. Congressman Barber lived there till 1844 when he passed away in the house. I might mention, though, while we're talking about the church, that we didn't have, if we go back to the 1700s, we didn't have, of course, 1600s, freedom of religion as we know it today. I mean, you had to go to church. And your town could not have and you could not have a church in your locality unless you were a bona fide town. So these people who lived in Groton and Groton Bank had to come to New London across that river every Sunday morning to go to church. So there were, you can see, after rowing across in many bad times, which had to occur from 1655 to 1702, that people in Groton wanted their own church. And they petitioned and so forth. And in 1702, they were granted the right to form a church in Groton, so they didn't have to go across the river anymore on Sunday mornings. And that first church was located in Center Groton. The second one was located between Center Groton and Groton Bank, and the third one was right in Groton Bank. In fact, it is listed as Congregational Church just north of, or on the 1868 map, just north of what's Old Kings Road, now Broad Street. The fourth one is up on Monument Street, and we'll come to that later. Back to our transportation story, and we're back now to the railroad bridge. There were other recreational forms of transportation, as you see from the Harvard race in 1893. And a quick zip down the river. Again, we see the Congregational Church, the Major Barber House, the Mother Bailey House was where this, behind these buildings, where this big tree is, and is still there. There was another form of recreational, well, of smaller boats. The Ferguson family was in the boat building business of smaller yachts and boats. But again, let me remind you, it was the ferry service that was still the primary transportation between between New London and Groton. And here we are at the old depot and parade in 1881 here in New London. This is at the foot of State Street. And this was just a hustle-bustle center too, as you can see. Many larger ships like the City of Worcester took people along the coastline, and here we have the ferry to Groton. Another closer up picture of it. There were boats to other locations like the Griswold Hotel. And so let's just hop on the ferry a minute and go across the river. As we cross, we see the railroad bridges again at the north and the Groton shoreline ahead of us. But not everybody was convinced they should take the ferry. There were still a few diehards who chose to row themselves across or sail across. You recognize the Groton Monument prominent on the skyline. Much of the shoreline in this area is the same as it was back 100 years ago. We're approaching Groton. And here, this is Horace Newberry's house today. The last time I showed this slide with my room on there, Horace thought I had moved to your house. And we find ourselves now coming in at the end of School Street again, and which you've seen before, the ferry landing, so I won't show those slides again. But let's just take a quick stroll south on transportation by foot. And I should add, in terms of transportation by foot, these ferries often didn't run in the winter because the river was frozen in many of those times. And people walked across the ice or took sleighs across. I've even heard tales of driving cars across. And in Thomas Mumford's days, he had a very big wedding for his daughter over in New London, I think in February, on which many guests came from New London and walked across the river, and there was a storm later that day and all the ice broke up. And so Mumford had guests for days. But anyway, going back to our walk south of the ferry slip, along where the trolley would run, was another typical business of the day, the tailor shop of Howard Edgecombe. Remember, back in these times, you didn't go to the mall and buy a suit. You either made it at home or you went to a tailor to have it made. This is the building that is Paul's Pasta today, for those of you who frequent Paul's Pasta. Across the street was another cloth man, but this was canvas and sail making, Byron O'Brien, large Victorian house. I point out this house on the hill, which we'll come back to. It was the home of Captain Jason Randall. And trolley tracks, the old Groton post office on Thames Street, another earlier era of when horses had to be fed. They tried to make it in modern times, but obviously didn't. And continuing down Thames Street, we get back into the residential area, and all of these houses are still there today. On the west side, ending with Horace Newberry's house here. Looking at Latham Street, again the Avery House. The Bishop Seabury Memorial Chapel, which was built in, which is a Gothic kind of architecture of the Victorian era, and of course named after the first Anglican bishop, Bishop Seabury, who was actually here in New London and St. James Church, if I remember correctly. Another house which happens to be part of the Biles Memorial Home. And across the street from this represented an important change that was occurring in Groton. This is the old utilities building, which was acquired by the borough of Groton when it formed in 1903 or thereabouts. This is the building has an addition off of it today, and it's been modified, but this is the former Seahorse on the Thames, now known as the River Cafe, is back in this section. You can see the tower at the pier in New London. And of course, soon they were busy at work. We needed to have... One of the things about Groton Bank was as I said, the people that lived here were relatively prosperous in the 1800s, and they wanted modern conveniences. They modified their homes to keep them modern. They wanted city water, they wanted paved streets, they wanted sidewalks, they wanted sewers. And of course, the rest of the townspeople didn't want to pay for that. So basically they said, okay, why don't you let us form a taxing district and we'll pay for it ourselves. And that's what led then to the formation of the borough of Groton in 1903, now known as the City of Groton. And of course, the City of Groton owns what's called the City Utilities, which is a fairly good business today that supplies water and electricity to many communities beyond the City of Groton, including electricity to Fisher's Island, New York. I think that's correct, isn't it, Horace? And I think water as far as, well, certainly into Ledyard, and I don't know if it goes further north than that or not, but most of the town of Groton as well. So anyway, this is early work of the city utilities starting to put some of those pipes in the streets. And as we quickly jump back to the bridge story and transportation, we see now there are two bridges. This is the year 1919, and the first auto and trolley bridge was activated because there was a new railroad bridge, and the old one was converted into a auto bridge. Here you see the old one, which this is the new one, 1919. That's the same railroad bridge that's in use today. And the old one was just to the south of that. And as I said, the decking was repaved and for autos and for a trolley track, so the trolleys could now go to New London. Needless to say, that led to the end of the ferry service in 1929. And another major happening, which occurred some 20-some years later, was the construction of the Gold Star Bridge, which is to the north here. And that, of course, diverted auto traffic down Route 1 and Route 184 and away from Thames Street, leading to the decline of Thames Street as the major commercial center in Groton. But some of the problems we have today existed then, too. Going back to Groton Bank, and it's getting late, so let me just quickly wind this up. I want to point out that there were a number of fairly prominent people that lived in this little neighborhood. We've mentioned before John Jeffreys. Remember, he launched the biggest ship in colonial America. Thomas Mumford, who was a famous patriot. Colonel William Ledyard, who was commanding the troops. His brother, Ebenezer Ledyard Esquire. His house is still in Groton Bank. And their nephew, John Ledyard the Traveler, who has been the subject of a couple of books now. This one by James Zugg was just published earlier this year and was the subject of a book signing ceremony in this very room some months ago. John Ledyard the Traveler, as a young boy, grew up along roaming the banks of the Thames River here in Groton Bank. The Mother Bailey I've talked about, and Congressman Barber, Captain Waterman Z. These Captain Buddingtons we're going to talk about as we see their houses. And Robert Gray was a Civil War hero, Medal of Honor type, and Cupboard D. Morgan businessman, Frederick Bill, a philanthropist, and Abby D. Slocum, a very activist woman in her day, who is the designer of the Connecticut state flag. So moving on, let's quickly run through the neighborhood up on the hill here. It's a little difficult running up Latham Street, but at the top in the early 1900s, we would have seen the house which belonged to Dr. Winship then. This is a Tudor mansion, if you will. It's opposite the Groton Monument on Monument Street today, but it didn't always look like that. This is what it looked like in 1852 when it was built for Reverend William A. Smith and his brother. It was a federal-style house, later purchased by Abby Slocum and her husband, who was a European count, and they had to have a more European-looking mansion. So it was converted to a Tudor style. But if you look at the chimney patterns and the well and so forth, those things were all in their same places. But out their back door, this was the view, because the back door was on Monument Street in those days. This is the Groton Monument, erected in 1830, the first monument of its kind in the country, as precedes Bunker Hill and Washington Monument, predates them. The top was extended in 1881, marking the 100th anniversary of the battle. Up to that point, you could climb that narrow circular staircase and look over the balcony down 130 feet or whatever it is. The monument house was a caretaker's house. This again shows the ruins of the fort. This then later became a museum and was enlarged. The Bill Library, which is just to the north of the monument, was the first library in Groton. donated by Frederick Bill, who grew up in Ledyard. He was a brother of the Henry Bill that gave the Bill Library up there. And this was dedicated in June of 1890. A smaller version of what we see today. But let's climb up the monument a minute and have a look at this upper part of the neighborhood. Looking south again, this is the same shot we saw earlier, only 4 houses on Baker Avenue. These are the piers now for the railroad ferry that I mentioned earlier. And this area this is 1890, this area began to grow in the next 10 years because Eastern Shipbuilding had purchased this property and lots of houses were built for various employees engaged in building those 2 big ships, the Minnesota and the Dakota. And you still see sailing vessels in the harbor. Okay, this is looking to the west from the monument. Again, the Governor Winthrop Ferry and the New London skyline. Looking north, we see the railroad bridge and a fairly populated hillside. Not a lot. This is again 1894, so few more houses than were there in 1868, but still a lot of vacant space. I point out this spot in particular, or well, before doing that, this is now the revamped English Tudor where Abby Slocum lived, and the Connecticut state flag always flies there because she was the designer of that flag. And the smaller version of the Bill Library. I point out this vacant lot because in 1910 there's another house there that is of some significance to Groton's history, and that is the house of the Fitch family. He was a fairly prosperous merchant and decided around after World War I that it was time for Groton to have a high school of its own. And Groton, up to that point, students from Groton took the ferry to New London or railroads to trolleys to Norwich or whatever to the Free Academy, but there was no high school in Groton. And the Fitches gave a substantial amount of money to the town of Groton under the provision that they would build a high school and name it after their son, Robert E. Fitch, who had passed away. Climbing back down those 160 steps, we're back on this dirt road called Monument Street, Prospect Street back in those days. Bill Library again, real quick. The little version of it was enlarged, first edition in 1905. Again, a gift of Frederick Bill, who made his money in New York City. Often described as the linen business, but it was really women's undergarments, but you didn't talk about that back in those days. Again, Groton had an old wooden grammar school, and Mr. Bill decided it was time for a new school, so he gave that too. 1912, this building was built, and he was fairly philanthropic, giving big amounts of money to the Congregational Church, and also gave Bill Hall here in New London, which is a Connecticut college. Just a few other examples of houses, Italianate style. Elisha Minor was an architect and builder on the bank. Colonel Hubbard D. Morgan was big in the Manhattan fish business, as well as others businesses. The Union, or I call it Union Hall, I don't know if it was, Ancient Order of United Workmen's Hall, which is still at near the bottom of School Street. It's now the home of the sub-vets. Back up at Colonel Morgan's house. Around the corner, down a picturesque Monument Street, we can take our buggy to the church, which was built in 1902. This is the fourth meeting house of the Congregational Church, dedicated. John D. Rockefeller gave the money for this stained glass window. His mother was an Avery from Groton. That was the connection. And Thomas Minor was a prosperous businessman. This happens to be my house today in Groton, and he also was a vice president of one of the banks here in New London. Back at the Congregational Church, if I can get this one. This is the oldest house on Groton Bank that we know of, the Joseph Latham House, built in 1717, a simple Cape Cod colonial. Joseph Latham was the builder of the house, but a man by the name of Patrick Ward lived there during the Revolutionary War battle and was one of the defenders at Fort Griswold. Some wounded were also reportedly taken to this house. The church again. Across the street is the house of Captain Reuben Kelly, who sailed primarily out of New Bedford, but lived in Groton Bank. And I might add that Captain William H. Allen, who broke Captain Morgan's record, as I said a few years later, also sailed out of New Bedford. Captain Morgan sailed out of New London. And north of him was Captain James Monroe Buddington. You need to keep these initials in mind. We've got James W. and James M. Buddington. James Monroe Buddington was a fairly famous whaler, and he went down in history. Probably the most notable thing he's known for is he retrieved the British ship called the Resolute, which was abandoned and in the Arctic ice, and brought it back to New London, after which it was refurbished, I think on Long Island, and then sent back to England. When that ship was decommissioned, Queen Victoria had two very ornate desks made out of its teak timbers. One of them was given to Captain Buddington, and the other was given to the President of the U.S. We don't know what happened to Captain Buddington's desk, but the President's desk is in the Oval Office. And so we have a little tangential history to the Oval Office with Captain James Monroe Buddington. His son was Captain James W. Buddington, waterman, and at first lived in the smaller house just north of him, and later other houses on Groton Bank. But Captain James Waterman is known also as a whaler and a sealer, and made the last whaling voyage out of New London Harbor. He left in 1908 on a whaling expedition and came back with no whales. And that ended the whaling era here in 1908. Next north was Captain Ebenezer Rattler Morgan. This is his house after the successful voyage, and I might mention that one of his whaling adventures is published by the Historical Society in this book called Life on a Whaler, which I guess is still available here. It's been for some time. So this was his house after the successful whaling voyage, and he lived in this smaller house in the 1850s, which is on Broad Street and is labeled on the 1868 map as Captain E. Morgan. Another famous captain in the area was Captain Waterman Z. Buddington. Z for Zebulon. He made his money in the West Indies trade, built this fine Greek revival in 1844, at which time it sat on a 10-acre lot on Broad Street. Across the street, decades later, was the new house of Carlos W. Allen, who had the big building at the ferry landing on Thames Street. And this shingle-style house is the home of Charles E. White, who was also a prominent banker He gained his experience in handling money because he was one of the trustees, a principal trustee, in addition to Morgan's son, of Captain Ebenezer Morgan's $1 million estate. And he wound up being the treasurer and secretary of the Savings Bank of New London in the early 1900s. Again, a Groton banker who banked in New London. And Belton Kopp of the Avery Kopp House was also one of the vice presidents of that same bank. Just another Italianate-style home. The Groton, what was originally the Groton Bank Baptist Church when it was dedicated in 1872, excuse me, an Italianate form of architecture. Another picture of it. And Captain Jason Randall's house, he was not a whaling captain, but a commercial captain involved in shipping coal and other cargo. But he owned his own ships, which were in New London, and he could keep an eye on his ships from this house on the hill in Groton. Henry Bailey, an important townsperson, other modern houses on Groton Bank. And now let's wind up again where we started at Fort Griswold. It is now 1912. The state now owns the property, and this wall has just been built. And there's a great ceremony to celebrate this event of the state taking it over. Look at all the people. And, of course, speeches and so forth. And more. Now look at this shot carefully and tell me what is the difference between this photo and the next one. Back. Well, it's 65 years. This represents the bicentennial in 1976, at which time the Groton Bank Historical Association was doing reenactments of the Battle of Fort Griswold. And this was the bicentennial reenactment. And you see the colonists defending themselves. We use the southern part of the fort as the auditorium, or for the audience. Indeed, the British attacked, and on the third assault were able to get over the wall with great bloodshed, though, on both sides. And we just want to bring you back to color so you don't get hit by a horse when you walk out. The British, a big onslaught. Colonel Ledyard surrenders, but was slain, as you know. And that completes the history of Groton Bank. I think in just some quick summary, I want to say a couple of quick things. Number one, this coming year is the 225th anniversary of the Battle of Fort Griswold. And nowadays, the Friends of Fort Griswold are doing the reenactments, and I believe are planning a large-scale one similar to what we did nearly 30 years ago. In some quick summary, let me point out, I hope I have convinced you, if you knew little about Groton Bank in the past, that it's a little bitty area that has been very important in local history, some national, and even a little bit of world history, and it's often been overlooked. It's only 1% of Groton's geographic area. Shipbuilding, I don't think anybody can debate its role there. Defense, it's clearly been there for a couple of centuries. It was locally, for Groton, a center of business and commerce, and which it shared many of those endeavors with New London, and the same with transportation. And it's been the home of a number of interesting, some nationally and known, and a few world-known characters over the past 3 centuries. and represents the history of Groton as we know it today, or more than any other portion. And what's nice about it is much of its old village character remains today, and I'm sorry I've gone over, but thank you.
I'm Katie Cody.
I'm Emma Cedia.
And I'm Anna Canberra.
And you're watching GPS 19.
Lock it on.
Hi, my name is Camilla Williams, and today we are here with Corinne Denode from Ledge Light Health District to talk about safe food handling. Welcome to Fitch Middle, Ms. Node.
Thanks for inviting me.
I'm Caitlin. Safe food handling is important to help prevent you from getting a foodborne illness. With the holidays right around the corner, most likely your family will be gathering for a large dinner. So what we'll be learning about today is important for everyone to know. Since we'll be using a turkey today as an example, let's start by discussing how we thaw a turkey.
Okay, well, we have a turkey over here in the refrigerator. We have our turkey in here. There's a few proper methods on how to thaw a turkey. This turkey we thawed for a few days. We took it out of the freezer and let it thaw in the refrigerator for a few days. You leave it in the refrigerator depending on how many pounds the turkey is. So that's one proper way to thaw a turkey. Another way is if you have a microwave that's big enough to hold a turkey, which probably not too many people do, you can put it in the microwave, or you can put the turkey in the sink and run it underneath warm running water, 75 degrees or less.
What are some factors that will help prevent a foodborne illness?
There are 3 critical factors that can help prevent a foodborne illness. 1, proper hand washing. 2, avoiding cross-contamination. And 3, proper food temperatures. Whenever you're preparing food, you want to use your hands as little as possible. So whenever you can use utensils, you should really use utensils. Today, we're preparing a turkey, but what we're talking about applies to all food items. And hand washing in particular is very important because many people have, not everyone, but a lot of people have what we call Staphylococcus bacteria, which is present around our mouths and noses. So it's very important to wash our hands thoroughly so when we prepare the food, the bacteria doesn't get onto our food.
If I have staph on my face already, then why does it matter if it gets on my food?
Well, that's a good point. A lot of people do have staph on their face already, but it's in such small amounts that, it doesn't affect us. But if the staph gets into an environment such as food or turkey, the staph can multiply, and it multiplies so much, so fast, that it can produce a toxin, which is not easily destroyed by heat. So why don't we talk a little bit about temperatures. Here is our DeltaTrack digital thermometer. Every household should have a thermometer. Sometimes it's just little probe thermometers with a little circle on top that registers the temperature. But this is what we're going to be using today to take a temperature of the turkey. When cooking food, it's very important that we cook food to the proper temperature, so then that way any bacteria that is present we can destroy.
If cooking helps destroy bacteria, what is the proper temperature we should cook this turkey to?
This turkey should be cooked to 165 degrees. Actually, all poultry items should be cooked to 165. If you have ground beef, such as hamburger, you can cook that to 155. And if you're cooking anything like a steak, that is 140.
Gee, this turkey has to reach 165 degrees. Why does poultry need to be cooked to a higher temperature?
Well, one main reason is because of Salmonella poisoning or bacteria, which is very prominent on poultry items. And the only way to get rid of the salmonella is by cooking the turkey to, or any poultry item, to 165 degrees. All right. Now that we've finished preparing the turkey and we're ready to make the salad, what should we do next?
Well, since we're handling raw meat, we should wash our hands thoroughly.
That's right. And the reason we're going to do this is to avoid cross-contamination. Do you know what cross-contamination is?
To transfer germs and bacteria from one place to another?
That's right. We were just preparing the turkey, and now since we're going to be preparing the salad, we don't want to contaminate our salad with any bacteria. Let's wash our hands. Be sure to use some antibacterial soap. Be sure to wash your hands thoroughly to get all the bacteria off and germs. Now that we've finished preparing the turkey, we can put it in the oven. Thank you, Caitlin.
You're welcome.
There we go. Right. Now that the turkey's in the oven, now it's time to prepare the salad. What should we do?
Wash our hands.
That's right. Oh, not good water pressure here. Okay, here's our salad. Now our hands are nice and clean, so no salmonella or any other bacteria can get on our salad. And we should remember, that doesn't just apply to salad. Any ready-to-eat food, you want to be sure that you wash your hands, because you were just handling something and now you're handling something that's ready to be eaten. So let's prepare our salad. All right. We're all set. I think dinner's almost ready to be served. What do you think? Okay, here is our turkey, and we're going to take a temperature of the turkey to see if it's done yet. And we're going to see if it's up to 165 yet. And it's not quite ready. It's at 158. A few more degrees. So let's put the turkey, be sure to sanitize our thermometer. Okay, let's put the turkey back in the oven for a little bit longer, and thank you, Caitlin.
You're welcome.
There we go. All right. Okay, let's check the turkey again. Hopefully it'll be ready now. I'm getting pretty hungry. I'm going to use my digital thermometer here. Now we want to be sure to sanitize our thermometer before we place it into the turkey. I like to use little alcohol wipes. That's the best way to sanitize it. And if you don't have alcohol wipes at home, you could also use some antibacterial soap and just wash it with really hot water to kill the germs. But like I said, I'm going to use the alcohol wipe. Okay. Now you want to be sure to stick it right in the breast of the chicken and then in the leg of the chicken, because those are the two thickest parts. And 165. So it's ready to be eaten, and again, clean your thermometer. And all set.
My favorite food with turkey is stuffing. Is there anything special we should do to prepare the stuffing?
Actually, you should always cook the stuffing outside of the turkey. A lot of people, they clean out the turkey and they put their stuffing in, and this is actually pretty dangerous, because the stuffing, it's all compacted into a ball pretty much, and it's very difficult to get the inside or the internal temperature of the stuffing up to 165 degrees, which is a safe zone, or 45 degrees or below if we were cooling the stuffing.
So, what about when we're done with the meal? How long can we sit around and pick at this bird, and should we store the leftovers?
That's a good question. Usually, you're at your Thanksgiving dinner, the turkey's been out for some time now, and you have a safe zone. It's about up to 4 hours. But really you want to get that turkey down to 45 degrees or lower as fast as you can. And by doing this, one thing that you can do to get it down to 45 degrees or lower is to take the turkey and put it into smaller portion sizes so it cools quicker. I like to slice up the turkey and then wrap it up and put it in the refrigerator.
We have been talking about the dangers of raw meat, but how do I know if I have contracted a foodborne illness?
Well, it varies from person to person. Foodborne illnesses, their common symptoms are vomiting, stomach cramping, diarrhea, fever, and also the elderly and young kids or young people or people who are sick are more likely to contract a foodborne illness than someone who's healthy. And also, if you do think you've contracted a foodborne illness, the only way to really know is to go to the doctors. Does anyone have any questions?
If anyone at home has any questions, please call Ledgelight Health District at 448-4882. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a healthy and happy holiday season. Thank you, Stop and Shop, for donating the turkey.
Thank you for having me.